Okay, so now we are going to jump into Photoshop. So I don't know how familiar you all are with Photoshop, so I'm going to assume you know very little. So let's start with that. So, okay, we have two sets of images. We have all the images we exported for the garden workshop, and we have all the images we exported from the Photo Studio interior view. So let's start with the garden workshop. First thing I want to do is open all of those images. Okay. So I'm on the Photoshop landing page right now, and it's just saying, hey, here's some images you've had open recently. Do you want to open any of these? The answer is no. So I'm going to go up to File, Open, and I am going to go to Garden Workshop Render Layers. Okay. Here they all are. And I am going to grab them all and just hit Open. Okay. Right now, we get 1, 2, 3, 4 different tabs of all of our images. Okay, now if I click through these, here they all are. Okay, I want to pick one of them that's sort of going to be the start of our new file. So we have 4 different JPEG images, but we want to make one new PSD image, which is a Photoshop document file. So I'm just going to say, hey, this textures layer image, that's going to be the start of my new file. We'll just save as that one and it'll turn into our PSD. So actually, why don't I do that first? I'm going to say File, Save As, Garden Workshop. I'll just say Render. And I'll change the type to a Photoshop document. So we're not getting rid of the textures layer. We're just save asing, basically. Garden Workshop Render PSD file. I'm going to hit Save. So here we have this PSD file. Now, if you look in the bottom right hand, these are your layers. So in Photoshop, think of layers like this. This is a list of information that's sort of stacked on each other. So right now I have one layer. That's my bottom layer. It says background and it's currently locked and it's this texture image. If I double click on it, let's try again. Oh, here it is. If I double click on it, this little window opens and it's saying, hey, actually, let me close that. Let me double click. We get this little window and I'm just going to call this texture. Okay, so I'm just changing the name of this layer that I have to texture, and now it's unlocked. So I double clicked on the layer, renamed it. Now it's unlocked. Here's my texture layer. Okay, I've got one layer in here so far. It's just this cool colors. Let's go over and grab I'm going to go over to the lines file that I have open. Now this has one layer in it, just lines, but I'm going to do Control A for select all. So I just did Control A and I'm going to do Control C for copy. I'm going to go back to my PSD render that has my texture layer in it and do Control V. And look at that. I have a new layer in here. It's my line work layer and it's on top of my texture layer. So I'm going to double click on layer 1 and call this lines. Okay. Now you'll see I have 2 layers, texture and lines, and I have 2 eyeballs right here showing that they're on. I could turn off this one. I see my texture layer. I could turn off this one. You see nothing happens because it's underneath this one. Okay, we need to sort of merge these layers in a way so that I see this line work overlaid on top of the texture file, because right now I'm not seeing textures at all and that does nothing for me. Likewise, if I turn this off, I'm not seeing any line work. That does nothing for me. So what you want to do is click on your lines layer, and under if I hover over this, this is called the blending mode. Right now it's set to normal. What I want to do is change it. I'm just going to click on this little arrow right here and change it to multiply. Now my line work layer is see-through. Specifically, everything that is white in the line work layer is completely see-through. and the black line work is showing now overlaid over the texture layer. Now, what's good about this? Well, one thing is I can hit the eyeball and turn it off, turn it on, turn it off, turn it on, so you can see the difference. Likewise, zoom in a little. If my line work is a little too intense, I can change. I'm currently have the line work layer selected. I can change the opacity of that layer, say to 50. Now it's 50% as strong. That actually looks pretty good right there. Turn it off, turn it on. Let's put it back to 100. You can also play with the slider here if you want. You put it to 100. See, it gets a little intense around the doorways and stuff. And I'm going to drop it down to 50. That looks good. Now, you can't do that in SketchUp. You can't separate those things like that. We can do that in Photoshop. That's what's really powerful about this. All right, so I'll leave that one for now. That looks good. I'm going to do Control S for save. So I saved my PSD render. So I'm going to switch back to my lines file here. We've already dealt with this. I don't need this anymore. I'm going to close it. We've done the texture layer, which is where this file originated from. So that one's in here. So here it is, texture. Got my lines in there. Now I'm going to go to my shadow layer. Now, here's a little trick I'm going to do in here before I bring it to my PSD render. I want every shadow in here to be like pitch black. Okay, so that I can really play with the shadows. I'm going to do exactly what I did with the line layer. I'm going to bring this in. I'm going to turn on multiply. So the shadows show overlaid and everything that's white in this image will become see-through. And then I can play with my shadows with opacity. But if I bring everything in right now as sort of gray, I don't have much play in there. So I want to bring it in as pitch black, and then I can tone it down. Okay, so how do I turn all this gray information to black? You do that with levels. So I'm just going to type in Control L for levels. Okay, now you get this little control panel here. We have our eyedropper on the left, which is all of the dark tones, light tones, and medium tones. I'm going to take the dark tones and I'm going to slide it over all the way to about where I start seeing this line work appear in here. I can go even further, but you can see I'm starting to lose some definition. You see that? So I'll go to about right where it starts. So I keep like my garage doors so they don't like go away. And then you can play with the middle dial if you want, but I think it looks good about right in the middle. So this looks like a t-shirt. This looks awesome. So this is like a nice high contrast shadow drawing. Okay. I'm going to hit OK. So all I did was change the levels in this layer, now in this file. Now I'm going to do Control A for select all, Control C for copy. I'm going to go back to my Garden Workshop PSD file, which has my lines in it, which has my textures in it. And I'm going to do Control V. Okay. Now I'm going to switch the blending mode here from normal to multiply. Pretty cool, right? So now we have all the shadows on our drawing as well as the line work. Now, this actually looks kind of cool, like with high contrast shadows like that. And that might be a graphic style that you like and you want to do in all your renders. You can certainly do that. I'm going to tone them down a little bit. I'm going to tone them down to say 60. Or I'm going to play with my slider and just see what's a good one. Maybe I just want to suggest them at like a 30. 23. Here's about a 30. Here's a 75. I'll do 75. That kind of looks cool. So look at this. Now I'm going to rename that layer. I'm going to double click on layer 1, just call it shadow. I'll do Control S. Okay, we've got texture in here, we've got line work in here, and we have shadow in here. Now, likewise, I can tone down my texture a little bit and bring that down to say 70, something like that. So that and then maybe I'll crank my line work to 100. Okay, so I got nice strong line work, but I took my textures down to 70. So they're not so intense. And maybe I'll crank my shadows a little more. Okay, so I have 3 different layers in here and I have 3 different controls over all of them. Okay, so that is the goal of what we're trying to do here. Make nice renders and have control over the information on those renders. So that looks pretty good right about there. Texture, lines, shadow. Okay, now if you remember, I'm going to go back to the shadow layer and just turn it off. It's going to ask if I want to save it because we changed information. I'm going to say no. I already have it over here. I don't need to worry about that file anymore. Really like the way this is looking. I like the tree shadows in here. I like all the shadows falling in here. This looks like a pretty sweet drawing that I definitely want to show a client. Now, I also brought in some sketchy lines. I'm going to do exactly the same thing. Maybe in this, I'll go Control L and darken everything up a little bit. You can see what I can do here. Hit OK. Control A, Control C, copy. Go to my render, Control V, and then go to my blending mode, change it to multiply. So this is kind of cool. We added some sketchy information over it. Now it's starting to look more like a sketch instead of like, hey, client, I got this whole thing figured out. It's all done. So this looks pretty good. Now you could turn off the lines and just keep the sketchy lines on. So you have a sort of sketchy line overlay. Let's change the name of that to sketchy lines. That looks pretty good. You could keep those on instead of the line work. That'd be fine too. So now we have yet another control in here. We have lines, we have shadow, we have sketchy lines. I could go back to SketchUp since I had this view saved and export all kinds of other crazy imagery and see what else I can do. So this is sort of where I want you to take it now. So this is our, we've exported imagery, we've brought it into Photoshop, we've got our image now, and we want to take it into then InDesign next. Now I do want to do one up, say that again. I want to do one more thing to this image to sort of tweak it even further. And I want to show you how to do that. So what I want to do is be able to sort of adjust the brightness of this image. Right now it looks a little dark, right? So how can I sort of tweak some of these like global controls? And I'm going to show you one that I like to use all the time. So if you come over here to here, I want to make a new layer. I want to make an adjustment layer. I'm going to click on adjustments here. Here are all your different adjustment layers that you can add. The one I'd like you to focus on is this one, levels. So I'm going to click on levels. Now notice I get this layer above all the other layers. If this layer is above all the other layers, this adjustment layer, it will affect all the layers below it. If it's just above one layer like this, it'll only adjust this layer and not these layers. What I want to do in this case is move the levels adjustment layer down to above texture. So it's just going to affect the texture layer because that's the one to me that looks the darkest. The other ones look pretty good and I don't want to like mess with those or brighten those up. So now I have a levels adjustment layer. And look at these controls are just like what we did in those other files. I can play with the right side, make it darker. I can play with the left and make it brighter. See how I can do that? And I can totally push this thing and make it kind of crazy. If I go too far, it starts burning out a little bit. I'm going to bring it to about here. And now I'll play with my middle eyedropper here and see if that does anything I want. I'll just get that into a nice spot. So that's really nice. So I've sort of brightened up everything on the texture layer. Now I can turn off lines, shadow, and sketchy lines just to see what I'm doing here. And I can say like, oh man, that's way too burned out. I can adjust this, pull this back a little. I can play with that. So that looks pretty good. And then I'll crank those on again. Pretty happy with how that looks. That looks like a really compelling, interesting drawing that I can share with a client. So I'm going to save this, Control S. Okay, I'm going to close this sketchy lines drawing. I don't want to do anything more with that. So I have everything in this PSD layered file. All those images I created are now in this one PSD file. I'm going to hit Control S again, make sure that's saved. Okay. So PSD files are layered files. Okay. Let's say I have all of these levels all these layers, exactly where I want them to be. All the opacities are exactly what I want them to be. 72 for shadow, lines I have at 100%. Maybe I'll bring this one down to 50. So I have more of my sketchy lines showing. Got my levels looking right. This image looks awesome. Okay, I'll hit save for the PSD file, but now I'm going to do File, Save As. Okay, in the same folder where that PSD is located, I'm just going to switch this to a JPEG. And if I save as a JPEG, it's just going to save it as a copy. Now you can see all those other JPEGs that I exported in from SketchUp are in there still. That's fine. But I'm going to export this as Garden Workshop Render JPEG. Okay, and I'm going to hit save. Crank everything as much as you can. Hit OK. Okay, so what did that do? I'm still in my PSD file. How come I'm not in a JPEG now? Because I just save as. When you save as a JPEG, you're just saving it out as a copy, as a flattened copy. It's not going to have any layer information in it. It's just going to have where the layers are currently set up in this PSD file, like a snapshot. So if I go to the folder that all these files are located in, I've got my line work, my shadows, my sketchy lines, and my textures from SketchUp. Got my PSD that I'm creating right here, and I have the JPEG that I just exported from the PSD file. I just saved as from the PSD file. Why did I do that? This is what we're going to bring into InDesign. Could we bring in PSD files? We definitely could, but they're really, look at this. This is 18.5 megabytes. This is like 2 megabytes. So by making it a JPEG, we can make InDesign run smoother. So that's why I did that. So I have my PSD and I have my JPEG, and now we're ready to go into InDesign. So a lot of information here, but that's how you compile all the exports you get from SketchUp. It's how you compile them all into Photoshop to make a nice, cool render. All right, I'll stop here. I'm going to do one more video of me just making the interior rendering just to give you another example, but I won't talk through it. So if you want to watch it, you certainly can.